I would like to introduce our third keynote speaker. He doesn't know how important he has been to my development as an educator, as a teacher educator. He wrote a book in 1983, I think, Phil, called The Egalitarian Ideal in the American High School. And I have been trying very hard to think about how I got a hold of that book. I don't know if my dissertation advisor advised me to read it or if I just got lucky in the bookstore one day. But that book shaped my abilities to try to think through educational matters very, very carefully. And so I have been a Philip Cusick admirer for decades. And I couldn't be more pleased to have him come to the campus to finally get to meet him and to tell him how much I have appreciated his work. Most recently, Phil Cusick has written a book called A Passion for Learning, and I give it my highest recommendation, and so do my students, my undergraduate students who have been reading it in my School and Society class. A Passion for Learning. That sounded to me like a title I needed to read, especially knowing the author. And it sounded to me like there might be some things in that book that would have something to say pursuant to our question today, why kids hate school. Because maybe that question of hating school is allied in some sense with this question of a passion for learning. Phil is going to talk some about his book, but he's going to also give you some context in other ways to his remarks. Please help me greet Dr. Philip Cusick from Michigan State University.
I know the students like my book because one of them told me they made me read your book. He told me that. He said that too. They made me read it. Okay. Well, that's okay. Did you read it was my question. So I didn't dare ask. That egalitarian book was a great book, but nobody read it because it cost $35 and you could run it off on a copy machine for $7.50. And it was one of the books that the publishers used to sue Kinko. It was a big case. They didn't give me a dime, but it was a big case. So thank you, Stephen. Stephen invited me because he was interested in a book I wrote about individual learning, and he suggested I talk about it, which I will do. But first I want to tell you a story about the educational system and why I got thinking about individual learning, and thinking about learning as an individual, not an institutional responsibility. So the book was about 7 Americans and their learning, and I wrote it because I wanted to say education is an individual, not an institutional responsibility. So I want to take about 15 minutes and talk about how we got to the point of thinking education is an institutional responsibility, because I think it has a lot to do with the kind of kids I've been hearing about for the last 2 days that you've been talking about. Our topic is why do kids hate school? But allow me to ask, why do we care if they hate school? When did we start caring, and what have we done about it? I'm not being disingenuous. I started teaching in 1962 at Thomas K. Beecher Junior High School in Elmira, New York. And at that time, the educational establishment that I had joined did not get upset over the fact that a fair number of students at Thomas K. and other schools were not interested in school, academic knowledge, or institutionalized instruction, or pleasing their teachers. Many of our students, many of the students they gave me, were pushing 16 or 17 years old, still in the 7th or 8th grade. And while their behavior was rarely terrible because they did not want a confrontation, possibly physical, often physical, with Principal Netsky, they resisted our enticements, academic learning, Principal Netsky, and left as early as they could. Did that bother us? Yes, in the sense that all teachers want receptive students. They allow us to do what we came to do. But we, the staff, did not blame ourselves, nor the organization, nor the curriculum, the school, nor the institution of learning, of schooling, for their disinterest, recalcitrance, and occasional instances of bad behavior. That was not our fault. In our open and egalitarian schools, it was assumed that any student could to some degree succeed if she or he chose to do so. The resistors were following their own volitions, values, beliefs, inclinations, family histories, and it was their own action that caused the problem. The staff, the school, and the system had opened its doors to all, provided a warm, dry, reasonably humane, and orderly environment. We gave them instruction, athletics, pencils, pens, paper, field trips, and ice cream socials. And the majority of students accommodated the situation. And for the ones that did not, it was their problem, not ours. We never blamed our values, our race, our class, whatever that means. We regarded it as axiomatic that the amount of learning and the possibilities for future learning that a student took away, was his or her sole responsibility. Our unit of analysis was the individual. That's my main point. And we had varying explanations of why Bucky or Melody or Harry or Kathleen, why do I still remember these kids, behaved in ways, I'll bet you do too, and that made them difficult to reach and inclined to leave as early as they could. But just as we did not blame ourselves for student failure, we did not take much credit for student success. Our unit of analysis was the student, singular, not the institution, and our goal was not equality. It was equal opportunity. Equality was a little too abstract for us. While we recognized that the children doing the least well were likely to be the poor children of the poor, we were fulfilling our responsibilities. That's the way we thought in 1962, well up into 1965. Something happened in 1965. And what happened was, in the mid-60s, some things happened. And it became no longer acceptable to take a cavalier attitude toward differential and largely reflective of social class behavior and achievement. And the first of these events was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, whereby President Lyndon Johnson, himself a former teacher, convinced a skeptical Congress that the reason people are poor is because they lack cognitive skills required for work. So if we give them cognitive skills via federal aid to education, we would enable these children to acquire skills, thus jobs, move away from dependence on welfare. That was Lyndon Johnson's argument. So schools all over the country, and especially schools like Thomas K. Beecher, received additional resources to direct toward lower achieving students. So the assistant superintendent called me and some other teachers down. He said, here's $10,000. What do you want to do with it? We had no idea what to do with it. Simple, but here's a key point. The key point, we're going to give more federal aid to education, and then we're going to move kids off welfare. That's the trick. The goal was equality of opportunity, and it was argued that the poor kids are not having an equal opportunity. And if you gave them an equal opportunity, you would get equal results. That was the logic of the argument that we started in 1965. Simple. Here's a key point. Accompanying the resources was a requirement of accountability. Please note the word. Some of you may recall how in the early to mid-60s, Robert McNamara, then Secretary of Defense, initiated a program to hold defense contractors accountable for federal funds. President Johnson became a convert to McNamara's measures and thinking, and the notion of accountability raced through federal programs and into education. And soon you could not attend an educational conference without hearing 30 times that the public is demanding accountability. Was the public demanding accountability? I didn't think so. But that's the cry. You know, when it gets in education's limbic brain, it doesn't get out. And that was the cry in the mid-60s. This is what happened. This is a little involved, but forgive me. Along with federal funds and accountability came state departments of education, enlarged by 5% of the money they receive for administering ESEA. 5% of $15 billion just in the first year is a lot of money. So combine federal funding, the doctrine of accountability, and enlarged state departments of education, and what do you get? State standardized test. That's how you got them. That's how we started this whole machine on state standardized test, which is what I've heard a lot of for the last 2 days. State standardized test, which when averaged by school, that's the second thing. Remember, I said the individual was a unit of analysis. ESEA, accountability, McNamara, and state standardized test changed the unit of analysis to the institution. It became the school's fault. That's what was different between 62 when I started, and 65 when ESEA started. That's what happened. We took the institution as the unit of analysis, and that's a huge change, a huge sea change. That's what happened with when ESEA punched in 65. So combined federal fund, I said that. But the state standardized test did something. They showed glaring differences between the scores in serving more and less affluent students. Now, in Michigan, the state superintendents were on the ceiling about this. And so they went to John Porter, the superintendent, and they said, John, if you give state standardized tests, we call them the MEAP. I understand you call them the MAP, we call them the MEAP, but I think they're the same thing. And so we said, I didn't say it, I wasn't there. I wasn't in Michigan yet. But they said, John, if you do this, if you start comparing school by school, invariably you're going to drive the rich schools, Bloomfield Hills, East Grand Rapids, Okemos, and it's going to show the poor schools down. And John said, well, I'll solve that problem. I won't let the scores out. He said that. They are mad at him to this day. They're furious at him. Hence the notion, so what do we get when we got standardized tests? Hence the notion of good schools versus bad schools. Now remember, our scores at Ernie Davis were the lowest in the county because we had the poorest kids, or some reason. I don't want to say that. But we didn't regard ourselves as a failing school. We didn't think of ourselves that way. But after scores were averaged by schools, we got a good school and a bad school, effective schools, ineffective schools, succeeding schools, failing schools. As soon as we started averaging by school, which doesn't make any sense to me. We knew at Thomas K. Beecher our Iowa scores were the lowest of any junior high. But because the unit of analysis was the individual, we did not think of ourselves as a less than successful school. But the events I've described forced schools, qua schools, to accept responsibility that we had formerly attributed to students. That was an interesting change. That was an interesting change. It's not okay to chase Harry out the door as Ed Netsky used to do. No, it's our fault that Harry wants to go out the door. Now that was a big difference. And so the last 40 years, this is what Coleman said. Coleman said in 68, Coleman wrote a very telling article in 68. He said somehow we thought our job up to that time was equality in. After 68, we thought our job was equality out. I thought that was a very trenchant observation by James Coleman, whom I admire a lot. And for the last 40 years, the whole educational establishment has been searching for institutional answers to issues formerly thought to be individual responsibilities. As Karen Scott reminded us yesterday in our opening session, our job is to improve the school experience and stop pushing students out of school. I just want to give a little aside here. An aside is Coleman in 68 and Jenks in 72 said they couldn't correlate school achievement with school effects. And it was translated roughly as schools don't make a difference. Well, I'll go into that. But what happened was you still can't. Every year I ask Steve Raudenbush. Steve Raudenbush is now at the University of Chicago, and he was a colleague of ours at Michigan State. And I ask him, Steve, is it still true that you can't correlate school effects with achievement? And he says, yes, it is. And I ask him this twice a year, too. Just recently he wrote, he said, Phil, the best estimate we can give is 18% of the variance in achievement can be attributed to school effects. So the point is that even after 40 years of effort, we're still asking ourselves for that key to the organization that will show the difference in achievement. We're still locked into, secretly in our innermost, we're still locked into those suspicions that the individual might be the unit of analysis. But officially, the official doctrine of the educational institution is the organization is the unit of analysis. Allow me to just review some mile markers in our 40-year search. An early one that I remember, because it started at Michigan State, was effective schools. When sociologist Wilbur Brookover, upset by Coleman and Jenks' late 60s and early 70s studies, saying that school effects were not associated with student achievement, and mistranslated as schools don't make a difference. Brookover and his associates embarked on a series of studies in schools serving economically poorer students, but where scores were high, and concluded that not only is achievement highly related to organization, but that any child can learn if we provide the appropriate teaching learning environment. And that was called the effective schools research. The trouble was that the respectable researcher said it wasn't very good research, but that point got buried away in some obscure academic journal. But that took hold in the educational establishment, and especially in administration, which I'm in. Brookover and his later associates, Larry Lazat and Ron Edmonds, created effective schools, which appealed to administrators on the defensive about test results and accountability. Another widely heralded effort was Coleman and Kilgore's, this is a little beyond, which noted that students in private, mostly Catholic schools, scored higher and had fewer discipline and attendance problems and attended college at a better rate, independent of their parents' social and economic status. Loosely translated, the lesson was that better schools are like communities, a lesson supported by Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's Good High School, Jerry Grant's The World We Created at Hamilton High, and Rutter's 15,000 Hours, all of which noted that schools in ethically based and community-like neighborhood or schools did better than students in schools that were less so. Continuing with this restructuring vein, we're looking for an organizational key to institute learning problems. And this is a little run through, starting with effective schools and then moving in community schools. Continuing in this restructuring vein, Ted Sizer, a friend of mine, came along in the late 80s with his coalition of effective schools, which suggested that schools were too large, bureaucratic, busy, filled with extraneous activities, and inattentive to the task of training minds. Sizer argued for a simpler structure, team teaching, fewer distractions, 80 students a teacher, and a culture of civility that would equalize opportunity and increase achievement. In the 90s, we're going up now, we're almost done because it's 2006, stimulated by the Reagan presidency, conservatives argued that the problem was a large and gluttonous educational bureaucracy, more interested in sustaining itself than in educating students. Those years were characterized by efforts to dissolve the bureaucracy. I remember in Michigan, the chair of the State Board of Education, choice, charter, and market. Get rid of schools. I'd love that idea. Get rid of schools. Send everybody $7,200 and let them do what they want. Those years were characterized by efforts to dissolve the bureaucracy, abolish the Department of Education, move the system to choice, charter, and voucher, and turn responsibility over to parents. That was the conservative agenda. Excuse me just a second. Until NCLB, it was the conservative agenda. All of these reforms continue to have influence, but in the 90s, the school reform industry, if I may speak of it that way, tired perhaps of trying to reform schools qua schools, shifted to the system, and systemic reform became the buzz. So from the individual as the unit of analysis, we shifted to the school. Then we were to reach beyond the school and even the district and engage in systemic top-down reform, top-to-bottom reform. Reform was to combine fiscal policies, state curriculum, state tests, and of course, increased state scrutiny. That was what President George H. Bush's Goals 2000 was all about. And the same line of thinking, systemic reform, has now morphed into comprehensive school reform, which fiscal and policy instruments, uniform content standards, everything's tighter, everything's more top-down. Closer scrutiny of teachers' classroom practices, even teacher educators, which blows us at Michigan State away. And of course, elevated levels of authority. This, along with dire predictions of being left behind in the global economy and a stream of invidious comparisons between the performance in American foreign students, is what NCLB is all about. Now we've moved. When I started teaching, the unit of analysis, the explanatory variable, was the individual. It was Harry's fault. He wasn't very smart and he wasn't a nice kid anyway. We chased him out the door. Ed chased him out the door with a stick. No, Ed didn't have to have a stick. Now then it was the school, then it was the district, then it was the state, then it was the system. We keep moving the unit of analysis up, further and further up. That's what I want to talk about just for a minute, the effects of moving the unit of analysis up and what it does. Because I have the advantage, the only advantage I have is I'm old enough to have started teaching in 1962. But it was interesting to me because I watched it go by. I watched all this stuff go by. And I was tangential to several of these minor movements I was in on it, or listened to them, you know. All of these forms, I note, are based on the sociological assumption that if we can control the structure, suitable behavior will follow. And the reforms of the last 40 years have been more and more directed at controlling the structure, from the individual to the school to the district, state, and now to the federal government. Now the question I would pose, are you with me here? You look like you're with me, but you never know. This is Missouri, you never know. Okay. This is not a rhetorical question because I don't know the answer. Have 40 years of organized efforts. You know the answer. 40 years of elevating the unit of analysis from the individual to the school, to the state, to the system, even to the nation. Efforts that have resulted in a larger and larger educational machine. Has the effort improved learning? Some things are definitely better. Minority attendance, minority achievement, more equitable treatment for women, for children of special needs. We had a very nice talk on special needs this morning I went to. For alternatively minded students, for vocational students, for immigrants. We've done a lot to cure some of the ills But in retrospect, I can see that we practiced in Thomas K. Beecher in 1962. We are now asking ourselves serious questions about social justice and engaging direct action to assist students who, at Thomas K. Beecher, we were happy to see the last of. We now, and I wouldn't recommend to anybody that we go back to Thomas K. Beecher. I would not recommend that we go back there. There are, however, a few caveats. Now, here are the caveats of 40 years' efforts to elevate the unit of analysis up and up and up. We get frustrated when it doesn't work at the school, so we move it to the state. And then the state gets frustrated because it doesn't work at the state, and then we move it to the nation. It's a little strange, I think. There are a few caveats. Educational reform is organizational reform. We don't reform education. We reform the organization of education. We don't go after education. It's too abstract. It's too out there. I don't know where it is. Find education. You know where it is. But you know where the organization is. You know where the money is. You know where the people are. You know where the people go. You know where the buildings are. You can find the organization. So what we're going to do, we're going to reform the organization of education. We reform the delivery system, the organization. And despite the advice of people like Ted Sizer, who say make it smaller, or our more libertarian friends who say get rid of it, or our conservative friends who say get rid of it, we have taken the option of vastly expanding it in the form of a specialized bureaucracy. This is what we do. We specialize and differentiate the bureaucracy. We hire more people for more functions, and this is how it operates. We hire more people, take on more responsibilities, divide ourselves into more functions. That's how bureaucracy reduces uncertainty. How do you reduce uncertainty in a bureaucracy? What's your job if you run an organization? Reduce uncertainty. You see something that isn't done, what do? You hire somebody. You see something you need done, what do? You give it to somebody else. What does that person do? She hires somebody. That's how the bureaucracy grows. It gets more people to take care of whatever is problematic. In other words, the actual form that reform takes is that of breaking the organization into more specialties, hiring more people to attend to those specialties, and that's what we've done. 30 years ago, we had one professional teacher for every 27 students. We now have one professional teacher for every 18 students. And while 30 years ago, 70% of the people in education were teachers, now that figure is 49%. 51% of the adults in education are not teaching school or administering schools. That's pretty surprising. I've been watching this for 20 years because I'm very curious about these costs. I started watching this some years ago, when all my friends were saying, we don't have enough money. What don't you have enough money for? And the answer is to support a system filled with aides, cooks, drivers, counselors, psychologists, secretaries, researchers, policy analysts, technical supporters, all of whom, the sum of whom, outnumber teacher and administrators. In other words, while the ostensible conversation is on achievement, standards, kids whom we're not doing well with, equity, social justice, state tests, and complying with NCLB, the concrete action, what we actually do to reform schools, is continue to create a bigger and more bureaucratic, specialized, and differentiated and expensive bureaucracy. Now, for some years now, teaching school, I ask students, and they're teachers, so I say, you start this in my little org theory class, and I said, now, just for a day or 2 days, write down everything you do, these teachers. I remember 49% of the people are teachers, 51% are not teachers. The idea of specializing in bureaucracy is to make production more efficient. So if the teacher has to spend her time counseling, we hire a counselor. If she has to spend her time on playground duty, we hire an aide. If she has to spend the time in the cafeteria patrolling the halls or potty patrol, we hire an aide. If she has to spend her time on testing, we hire a testing expert. All of these people are hired in the interest of enabling the teacher to do more of what the teacher should be doing. That's how organizations operate. That's why you specialize. It's science of shoveling, according to Frederick Taylor, a brilliant man who operated in the beginning of the 20th century. But he said, look, we got too many people who are supposed to be shoveling, and they're running around doing all this other stuff, finding their shovels or sharpening their shovels or borrowing a shovel. We have to put somebody in charge of shovels. And then that person will take care of shovels, and the shovelers will be able to do their business. Well, we hire people to do that other stuff so teachers can do their business, right? Now, the insidious thing is, this is what I check, and I've been watching this for a long time. Not only do we have more people not teaching than teaching, but even the teachers are spending more time on transaction costs. So I say to people, how much time do you spend attending to the needs of the organization? The transaction costs are the needs of the organization. That's what transaction costs are. When you join a little firm, you and two other people, you have to take some of your effort and devote it to the running of the place. You can't just run your private operation. You have to take a little bit of your effort, put it over here. Those are called transaction costs. So how much time are teachers spending on transaction costs? And the answer I get back consistently, and I've been doing this for years, and I've done it with literally hundreds of people, and I'm being conservative, 35%. That's what teachers tell me. Teachers tell me they are taking 35% of their activity and devoting it to the organization. That is testing, that is in-service, that is professional development, that is school improvement team, that is doing what they have to do in forms, that is special education meetings, 35%. Now add it up. 51% of the people don't teach. But we hired those 51 so we could teach. Just assuming we're all school teachers, just for a minute. We hired them so we could teach. But 35% of our time is going to the institution. Now you come close to something between 60 and 70% of the human capital in education is getting devoted to the organization, not to productivity. Why did Russia fall apart? Russia fell apart because they couldn't get anything done. The machine got too big and too consuming, and they couldn't get anything done. And that's what Gorbachev said in late 1980s and early 90s. He said, we can't go on like this. We can't get anything done because the energy is being directed into maintaining the organization rather than to satisfying the needs of the people or making something. You have to be careful of transaction costs. It costs a lot. It's insidious. It's simple to say, we'll hire a specialist. We'll hire somebody to take care of computers, and then teachers don't have to take care of computers. It makes sense to me. As a teacher, I don't want to take care of computers. But that person demands some of my time. The people whom we hire to help us be more efficient want our time to help them do their job. And everybody winds up spending more time on the organization. I think it's really strange. I don't know if you think it's strange or not, but I think it's really strange. I think it's really scary. And I think it's scary because I think there comes a point where it doesn't work anymore. I think it comes a point where the organization, like Russia, that's why I told you about Russia, it just weighs itself down. The gentleman from Kansas gave a great talk yesterday, the man who did the test. And he said, we go down to teachers and we give them a new directive, and then we give them 3 pages of text. I loved it. It was a perfect example. Because now what does that teacher have to do? She has to read 3 pages of text. What is she not doing when she's reading 3 pages of text? She's not teaching school. She's not attending to the kids. That's what I mean by an increase in transaction costs over here. Just because you specialize and differentiate the organization over here does not mean that the people assigned to productivity get their job done. I have to go. I have to hurry because Stephen tells you if you're late, Okay. So there are a few things. I think we're getting there, aren't we? Okay. The first is that everything is more expensive in money, time, people, expectations, and we have created a much more dense and demanding educational system. A corollary of that, I didn't talk about this, is authority moves up. Now, bureaucracy moves authority up. I know all the talk about shoving authority down, but you can't not shove authority up when you increase bureaucracy. You can't do it. You can talk about it. You can talk about common decision-making and democratic decision-making and school improvement teams, but the fact is, in a more bureaucratic organization, authority moves up, policymakers' importance moved up, and administrative authority moves up. The third caveat is about equity. And I would just ask you this because I don't know the answer. The problem is our goal is always equity. Everything we've done in education is based on equity. The problem is, and David referred to this the other day, equity is moving away from us at a faster rate than we are keeping up with. The goal might be moving away from us at a greater rate. Oh, I said that. The importance of education, the increasing fact of education as a private good with exchange value. The anxiety of the already well-off and those who want to be to get their children into better schools in order to enhance their life chances. the fact that educational credentials are more and more used to legitimate social distances and to justify social inequities, as Daniel Golden reminded us in a new book, are all increasing. We reformers view education as a collective good, use average scores as units of measure, levels of organization as units of analysis, and standardized outcomes as evidence. What we don't account for, however, at the other end of the social scale are ambitious parents and students competing for society's preferred places, whose educational aspirations exceed the institutions, to whom equity is an abstraction and average scores a matter of indifference. Also increasing is the social and fiscal distance between the better and less well-off. David referred to a gated community in Ames, Iowa. I thought Iowa was a gated community, but I've never been to Iowa. Okay, this is a quote I took from The Economist the day before yesterday. The bounds of society are being strained. A new aristocracy of talent is retreating into golden ghettos and running the global economy in their own interests. The logic of talent is meritocratic. The logic of democracy is egalitarian. The two are bound to conflict. Now I would just ask you, I don't have the answer because I'm a school teacher, you know, and I always liked Weber's explanation of what a school teacher is supposed to do. He said the job of the teacher is to point out inconvenient facts. Facts that are inconvenient for party opinions. And that's a nice quote. I always like that. So I don't consult because people say, what do you do? I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I would just ask you, though, in the face of recognizing what we have done in the name of equity, build this gigantic and expensive and time-consuming machine, the assumptions we have made about the organization, I would ask you, have we had increased equity? I don't know if we have, but I'm not sure that our efforts to increase equity through these moves have decreased inequity. But I think that's a question you have to answer and not me. That's the first part of my talk. The second part, I'm going to tell you briefly because I took more time than I meant to when I was talking about this, but I think it's important. About NCLB, I just want to say one thing about NCLB. People slam NCLB. I heard it slammed for 2 days. But all Mr. Bush and Mr. Kennedy and Mr. what was his name? Ron Page, when they put NCLB in, all they did was stretch the logic that the educational institution had been using for 35 years. We said, we, the educational machine, that's who you are, and I'm a part of it. I regarded myself as a part of it since '62. We said, if you give us the resources, we can solve the problem. We accepted the assertion, the premise, if you will, that the institution is the unit of analysis. We bought it. And all NCLB did was call us. All right, let me see your cards. I'm calling you. What do you have? You said you could solve the problem. Well, solve it. But I just want to point that out. They didn't invent the idea of the unit of analysis being the organization. We did, because we were embarrassed when Coleman and Jenks said the unit of analysis is not the institution. That was a huge thing in education in the late 60s and 70s. Huge change. We were embarrassed. We were ashamed. You mean we cannot make a difference? It's what the kids bring into school that makes a difference? No. We can make a difference. And we said we can make a difference. So NCLB, for my disagreements with it, and I share some of the disagreements I heard you express, it is a logical extension of the educational establishment's thinking for the last 40 years. Which is why I wrote a book. So I sat down and I said, this doesn't make any sense, and I'll be brief with this. But I wrote a book. I said, this doesn't make sense. I mean, education is more an individual than an institutional responsibility. And to argue the case, I said that what I would do is take the education of 7 eminent Americans. And I started with Benjamin Franklin and Abraham Lincoln because I wanted people who hadn't gone to school. And then I went to Jane Addams because I wanted a woman. And then I went to W.B. Du Bois, whom I did not know and came to admire a great deal. And then I went to Eleanor Roosevelt, whom I had the pleasure of meeting while I shook her hand. And then I went to Robert Oppenheimer, and I wanted Oppenheimer because I wanted someone Jewish, and I explained why I wanted someone Jewish. And then I went to Dorothy Day, and Dorothy Day is a Catholic activist, anarchist social worker, lived in New York City, and because I wanted a Catholic, and I'll tell you why I wanted this diversity of religion. So I'm going to quickly go through this. but they had some things in common. And I said, what I'm going to do is read their works, their bios, their autobios, their letters, their diaries, read whatever I can read around these people, and then I'm going to see what they called their education. That's what I'm going to do. So I wrote this book, and I wrote it to counter what I explained. The first part is this obsession of ours with the organization with the institution of education. What did they do? Early and serious reading. Even Lincoln, who grew up in a log cabin and they were desperately poor. Well, they were poor. I don't know if they were that poor. They lived like the pioneers lived in a non-cash economy. But I don't know if they could be called that poor. But they read the Bible. They read Plutarch's Lives. They read poems, and they read everything they could find. And around the early part of the 19th century, there was a large informal educational system. We didn't have an institutionalized system. We had a large informal system. And people would lend books around. And bright elders were on the lookout for intelligent youth. And that's where Franklin quit school in the 8th grade. And that's where they got their education. So these people didn't go to school, but they got an education from these people who lent them books. And they had something else. They understood, and I don't know what to say about this, but they understood that learning makes one better, not merely better off, and that learning is a moral obligation. That was something I didn't intend. I didn't intend to get into morality. I didn't intend to start talking about religion. But these people, excuse me. They were evangelical Protestants, and that's why I wanted someone Jewish and Catholic. But you were better if you learned. You were a better person, and it was a moral obligation, and they were brought up with this. The second thing they did, well, they read early. They understood it was a moral obligation, and they understood big ideas. They intuitively, the people about whom I wrote, understood that ideas have power. It's so hard for us telling kids that. Ideas have power. They just got it. They got the ideas they got the notion that ideas have power, and they were ambitious. They wanted to take part in big events, and they knew if you had big ideas, you could take part in big events. That's how they did it. That was their beginning education, and briefly, they went on to expand that in work. And they went to school. They went to school and took what they could from school. They were very aggressive students, all of them, and they never looked behind the lessons at the teacher, and they never complained. They read everything. They did their homework. They took everything they could from education because they could see that they were on their way to something important. And then what they did, they moved into work. And what they did in work, the way they behaved, and this goes back to their education. I kept trying to tie in the big ideas to the education, to their later accomplishments. I kept saying, how did they get eminent? They made themselves eminent by educating themselves. That's my premise. And one of the things they did with the big idea, they could handle big ideas. And that was one of the biggest things, because when they moved into their work, then their ability to handle big ideas was recognized. Eleanor Roosevelt was the one who helped me with it, because she was a very well-educated woman. And as she moved into democratic politics were all over the place. But with her big ideas, she could see her way through to a few key things. And she became a valued member of the organization. The other thing they did, they attended to details. So they attended to details, and they had big ideas, so they moved into positions of authority because people could trust them. People could trust them not only to do the little things, but they could trust them to have the big ideas, and that was how they did it. And that last thing was so important to them, attaining leadership. They attained leadership because people trusted, because they had the big ideas, and because they were trusted, and because they understood how to, well, what they did, they all made a study of themselves. They all studied themselves, and they all asked themselves, how do you do what you want to do? And they studied their behavior, and they studied their processes, and they made a study of how to get ahead. And that was part of their education. So there's one quote. I want to just quote a thing. And there were moments in their lives when they suddenly had to face things. Here's one, W.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois is a scholar and a writer, and he's going to reduce inequality by writing and making speeches and illustrating the irrationality of racism. And something happened. He was teaching at Atlanta University, and a man was lynched. our man was accused of murder, a black man. And so Du Bois, in his characteristic, thoughtful way, was going down the street to deliver a letter to the Atlanta Constitution when he got the message. Sam Hose had been lynched. His knuckles were on exhibition in the grocery store. I turned back to the university. One could not be a cool, calm, detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. I regarded it as axiomatic that the world wanted to learn the truth if the truth were sought. That was, of course, but a young man's idealism. So that's what I looked for in that book. I looked for those moments when one has to face oneself and one says, look, I can't be this anymore. I have to do something else with my life. So and those are the kind of things I included, not only their early reading, their early writing, their early ideas, their study of themselves, but those moments in which they had to face themselves and say, this doesn't work, I have to be a different person. I'm going to quote just the end. The educational elements demonstrated in the book: intellectual curiosity and accompanying autodidacticism, ethical striving. Ethical striving was just so important. Not, a good person was a learned person. Learning made one better, not merely better off. That was my best line. Curiosity and the accompanying autodidacticism. Identification with enlarged social issues may be encouraged in schools, but they are the responsibility of the individual. It is not in school but in life where the knowledge one learns in youth is turned into action, and knowledge and action combined into the person one is. Our 7 subjects show us that education requires the choice of learning as a way of living, and requires as well what Ortega y Gasset calls a life of effort, ever set on excelling oneself. That's my story. So I started looking at the institution, and then I said, we've gone too far in this direction. We've got to put education back into the individual and take the individual as the unit of analysis. Thank you very much. It's okay, I can hear you.
We do have a few minutes for questions, and then we'll start the discussion.
105?
Any questions?
If you ask a question, I'll cry. Stunned. Stunned they were. That explains it. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I owe you. Go ahead. You did. You had to read it. Great.
She's one of my students.
They made me do it.
We were asked in class to think about what the implications for teaching are, and I just thought I would ask you directly what your implications for teachers are.
Hold on.
That's a good thing, David. Thanks. What are you doing? What are you doing? Oh, you're asking. Oh, we're still asking a question. I didn't know. I thought maybe that was a trick question or something.
No. What are the implications for teachers?
You know, I go back to everybody's complaining about the weight of the machine, but I really think the machine is going to fall of its own weight. I don't think we can continue building this machine in the name of equity. It's getting too expensive. It's getting too big. It's weighing too much, and I think there'll be a suspicion of our inbredness. Educators are inbred. They talk to the other educators, and they go around talking about good for kids and equity. But I think we'll have enough outside pressure to reduce the machine. And I think as teachers, what we have to do as teachers, is sort of find a way through to teach school in the middle of all that machine. I know I have to do it too at Michigan State. We have this big machine. More and more of my time is spent explaining my actions to the machine, but I still have to fight that. But I think in the long run, the growth of the machine can't be sustained. That's why I gave you the example of Russia. Russia had to change. They couldn't get anything done. And if 65% of the human effort is going into maintaining the machine, it's got to fall of its own weight. I just don't think that can continue. It doesn't make any sense. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Wait.
Don't
Sorry,
know.
we couldn't hear you too well up the back here, but I did have one. You said a comment there about education makes you better.
Right.
It was also, I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt also said that to educate a person without morals is to educate a menace to society. So if Ted Kaczynski has a PhD, is he a better person because he's educated?
I mean, the Unabomber, well, yeah, he was crazy too.
Yeah,
I mean,
well, that
doesn't help to be crazy.
No,
Yeah.
but that's what I was meaning. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll be a better person. And I know that was Socrates' belief, to be a good human being. And education would help you by asking questions and being a critical thinker. And so that was what was really concerning me when you made that statement.
Well, it came in from the, that's why I got into religion, because it came in from the Puritans. The Puritans believed you had to read Scripture, but they also believed, the Puritans had a profound influence on American education.
Yeah.
You had to know the Word of God.
Yes.
You also had to know the works of God. So along with studying Scripture, you had to study math and chemistry and agriculture and fisheries and astronomy. And that idea of being a worthy person in the sight of God, because the one who knew the works of God was a better person, that was such a profound influence on our American system. I didn't start thinking of this until I was writing about W.B. Du Bois,
Right.
but they were all Congregationalists, which came from the Puritans. And this idea of knowledge as making oneself worthy in the sight of God was so important. And last year we had Michigan. We had the Cherry Commission. The Cherry Commission commissioned a study of all the schools in Michigan, and it was all utilitarian. It was all get a job, get a job, get a job, get a job. It was all get a job. I was thinking of that.
Yeah, and I think that's where I was.
Yeah.
What I wanted to check on, because
Yeah.
when I see like W.B. Du Bois and his beliefs and values that came through in his educational studies of the Philadelphia Negro in particular.
Right.
I mean, he was looking at those issues.
Right.
And,
That's right.
So,
I
thanks so
learned a
much.
lot reading Du Bois. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
This will be the last question before we
Good.
take a short break and then have
Okay.
our panel discussion.
I always get the last question. I have a couple of questions for you. You've asked, well, it's really a twofold question. You've answered that you think that the machine will collapse like it did in Soviet Russia. And first, I'd like to know where you think our perestroika will originate from. I like the metaphor. And second,
What will metaphor?
our perestroika.
Oh,
You know,
a
our
good word. Yeah, thank you.
reforms. And moreover, what do we do, those of us who will be teaching, to avoid the sort of economic and social collapse that the USSR experienced shortly after
Good
they
point.
abandoned communism?
I don't think the whole machine is going to collapse into anarchy. We're not going to do that because we're still divided into 16,000 school districts across 50 states. We're still divided that way. And the federal aid is really only 8%. What I think will collapse is the assumption that we can just keep pushing authority up the organization. The danger in this testings is more narrow. This is why it will collapse. It will collapse because we'll more narrowly define education to what schools can do. And we'll ignore all those important things that schools can't do. But those things will still have to be done. People will still have to get into education independent of their scores on the achievement test. See what I mean? That's why if we more narrowly push the definition of education into what schools can do, we're ignoring most of education. And nobody is so silly as to do that. That's why I think it will collapse. I don't think that, and that's what I see happening. I see the curriculum being taken over by the testing, and the testing more narrow. And this gentleman from Kansas was terrific yesterday. I don't know how many of you heard him, but more narrowly and narrowly defining education. And it just won't work because we know intuitively that what you learn in school isn't that important anyway. How much of you did you learn in school that you carry around with you every day and do what you did? I'll wager not much. That's why I think it will fall apart. I don't know what it will look like, but I think you'll be okay. Yeah. Well, I talked to this lady last night. I was very impressed with her intelligence, and I thought, she's really smart. She should go to Michigan.
Thank you, Philip, for your remarks.
Okay. Thank you.